Hello, hello. Welcome back to Collin and Mono. My name is Collin Sparley, and I am your host. This is episode 2. Can you believe it? We made it to episode 2, y'all. Got a lot of positive feedback about episode 1. So that being the very first episode of this podcast, I was really anxious to hear what other people thought. And it has been pretty much all positive and a little bit of constructive feedback too, which I'm always thankful for. But episode 2, I know some of you guys have been requesting me to talk about video games or thought I was going to talk about video games a lot on this podcast. Well, here you go. Of course, video games will be a little bit of a focus on this show, but it's more so because that is my own personal taste. It's not so much that this is just going to be a full-blown video game podcast, because that is not what I had in mind for the show. However, I do love talking about video games. So I brought on a friend of mine. His name is Chase Williams, and he is a producer at a studio in Hamburg, Germany called Eno Games. Before that, he was also a producer at Sony San Diego, which they're known for the MLB The Show baseball video game series. But more relevant to this conversation, Chase does research on video game philosophy in his spare time, and that's where I wanted to take this particular conversation, because both Chase and I have a background in studying video games in an academic sense, and I would see him posting on Twitter a lot about his findings through his research and how he was kind of thinking about video games in new ways and how it's potentially pushing the medium of art forward and how much there is literature-wise about this whole subject. And so I figured I would reach out to Chase, sit down with him, and talk about the deeper meaning behind video games as art. And not only that, we do get into a little bit of the accessibility of video games, or making video games accessible, rather, from a gameplay standpoint. So it's a super great conversation. Can't wait for you guys to hear it. Can't wait to hear your thoughts on it. But I'm not going to talk too much more. Let's go ahead and get the show started. Record.
Boom.
All right, man. So let's get into let's say a warm-up discussion. So I want to know, Chase Williams, how you feel about breakfast cereal. Do you have strong feelings?
So the thing about breakfast cereal is I don't eat it that much anymore, right? Like, especially
I feel like that's the common explanation for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's just everybody has the breakfast cereal as a cultural touchstone in their childhood, and it's almost like you look at breakfast cereal with a nostalgic twinkle in your eye, where you're like, man, if I could go back and know what I knew now as a child, picking and eating breakfast cereal, I would appreciate it so much more, because breakfast cereal now is totally unpractical. Like, it's unhealthy as shit, and you're like, you shouldn't even really be eating that early in the morning. But so I'm at a point where I'm not even surrounded by the breakfast cereal options that I used to be surrounded by, because German grocery stores have their own breakfast cereals. And in fact, for them, breakfast cereal is just basically oatmeal. And so I will tell you this much, like, I still miss it. Sometimes I eat breakfast cereal, or what they say as muesli here. I will eat it in the evening. You know, I'll fast usually like until 1 o'clock or so in a day. And then I come home and I will fill up a pint glass of oatmeal, and I will pour
a pint glass?
A pint glass. Because I have like
a cup.
Like a cup. Yes. Because I have very few bowls. I have very few kitchen wares, and I just wash them over and over again. But I fill up this glass with muesli, and I pour in a nice almond milk, and I'll eat that almost every day. So what I'll tell you is this: I still miss the standard American classic breakfast cereals. And And instead, I substitute it with like an adult version to still get that nostalgic feeling, you know?
It's when you hit a certain age and then you just upgrade to like fucking granola and yogurt or oatmeal.
Exactly. And the more, and if you got little chocolate chips in your granola, then you still haven't let go. If you've got like even dried raisins and cranberries, then it's like, hey, what are you really doing here? You know that's extra sugar. Don't be fucking around with that.
So when you were a cereal eater, an American cereal eater, what was your go-to box?
So, I mean, there's a lot going on here, right? You've got Lucky Charms, which I think is top tier. Okay.
Top tier is Lucky Charms.
I think top tier is Lucky Charms because not only do you have the delicious marshmallows, but even the little wheat shapes. And here's where the true hidden magic is. Some of those wheat shapes looked like items in Zelda Ocarina of Time that you needed to collect in order to move into adulthood.
Oh shit!
If you recall, I can't even remember what they called them. You had to. There was 3 like little stones you needed to gather before you could go into the like Cathedral of Time and pull the sword. Yeah. The fire one was like a tri-tipped little diamond. There is a specific shape in Lucky Charms that looks exactly like that.
Dude, I never thought about that.
These are the kind of connections you got to make.
I know exactly what you're saying too.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So that one's classic.
So Lucky.
I'm a big fan of Cookie Crisp, and then I have to give a shout out to my dog CTC Cinnamon Toast Crunch.
CT Crunch.
Because not only is it delicious, but people talk about like, oh, if you have Cocoa Puffs, it makes the milk into chocolate milk. But if you have CTC, it turns your milk into fucking horchata, dude.
No, listen. So I have a hot take when it comes to CT Crunch.
Okay.
I have a hot take. So somewhere along the lines, it must have been like maybe 5 years ago now, I remember when you would buy a box of CT Crunch, it would say on the box, now with more cinnamon and sugar taste or some shit. They fucked with the formula.
Yep.
And the moment they did that, I'm like, it's too much.
Yeah, we're okay.
It's too much cinnamon and sugar. It's too sweet. I can't do it anymore. I can't drink the milk afterwards anymore because it's too fucking sweet, dude. I can feel myself getting a cavity when I eat it. Like it's too much. So when it comes to cereal, for me, my favorite cereals are like some of the most deep cut shit. It's like, you know, the guy that's only likes the B-sides when it comes to a band or something that. Like I like fucking Oreo O's, dude.
Oreo O's are great. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that Oreo O's do not deserve to be in the discussion.
Yeah, Oreo O's are like one of my favorite because there's a balance of sweet and salty. And I would go as far as to say that Oreo O's, the cereal, is better than the fucking cookies.
You know, I mean, because here's the deal. The cookies are only good if you go with double stuff or above, right?
I disagree with you there, man. I don't like a whole lot of cream in my Oreos.
Okay, so then you like more of the cookie, and that's why maybe you like the Oreo O's because it's primarily cookie flavor.
Exactly.
I see.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you get that dash of salt in there, man. Oh, it's so good. It's sweet and salty all the way.
It's pretty special.
And then, I don't know if you remember this, but do you remember strawberry blasted honeycomb?
Dude, I have to be completely frank with you. I do not.
Oh, fuck. So you've had honeycomb, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Everyone knows honeycomb. But for a good while, like it was a limited edition cereal, quote unquote. But for the longest time, but it was on the shelves for like 5+ years.
That's how they get you, dude.
Yeah, exactly. It's like limited edition, what, for the past 5 fucking years? Right. So basically all it was honeycomb, but it was mixed in with these red honeycomb that were strawberry flavored. And that fucking cereal was insane. Like it was so good.
Yeah.
Like and the strawberry flavoring that they used, it didn't taste like artificial strawberry. It tasted way more like natural strawberry. Almost like what you would taste in like fucking. Do you ever have Rice Krispies with the dried strawberries in them?
Yeah, I've seen those.
Yes. It tasted like that, but honeycomb, the sweetness of honeycomb.
Yeah.
It was my favorite fucking cereal.
You're painting a breakfast picture in my mind. I can see it.
Yes. All right, man. I could talk all day about cereal, but what do you say we start the show?
I think we're good. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I think we're good. Okay. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Collin and Mono. My name is Collin Sparling, and I am your host. Today, I am joined by a special guest. His name is Chase Williams. How are you doing today, Chase?
Dude, I'm doing great. It may be day for you, Collin, but it's 9:30 at night in my time zone, my friend, and I'm fucking stoked to be behind a microphone recording my audio yet again.
So, Chase Williams is a producer that works out of Hamburg, Germany. He's a producer in the video games industry. So why don't you give us a little bit of background there, Chase?
Yeah, sure. I moved to Hamburg in January of 2019. It is currently August. And
yeah, from the United States, right?
Correct. I moved specifically from California. I was living in San Diego for about a year and 8 months before I moved. And prior to then, I lived in Austin, Texas, and I went there. I lived in Texas my entire life. That's where I was born. I was born in Houston, but I went to school and ultimately graduated from the University of Texas in Austin in 2015. And there I got my first job in video games as an assistant producer, where I moved to San Diego to work for San Diego Studio for PlayStation, again as an assistant producer.
Awesome.
And then finally got a role as actually as a product manager at a company called InnoGames, which is basically I would say product management and production is almost identical in terms of what the responsibilities entail, and that's what I'm doing now.
Hell yeah, man. So Chase does some really awesome stuff in the games industry. But if you follow him on Twitter, and this is where I'd like to take to the discussion, if you follow Chase on Twitter, you see him post about his notes and his research a ton when it comes to video games as art and how we perceive art and things like that. And so the cool thing about Chase is he has this interest in sort of academia when it comes to this sort of stuff, applying theory and things like that. So why don't we go in that direction, Chase, and tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm really happy to discuss this kind of thing because this is like, it's almost like the production side of video games is my job, and then the theory is my hobby, right? And
I love it.
To kind of give you and everybody else a quick summary of how I got into this, basically in 2015, I was about to graduate from school as a senior, and my degree was international relations and global studies, and that is a liberal arts major, which means it is mostly focused on writing. And so for my final semester, I needed to write a capstone paper, and these capstone papers need to be about like 25 pages long or so. So I would say long in the sense of being a freshman writing your first essay, but short in the sense of it's not a thesis or anything like that. And the subject that I chose was trying to insert video games into international and global relations curriculum as a major cultural media, because when you choose international relations at the University of Austin, you can choose from different tracks. You can choose from an international security tract where you learn about like power between nations, international relations from the stance of like economy and military, and that was the track that I chose. And then you can choose international politics, and then you can choose like global media or like culture. I can't remember the exact title, but there was a track that focused on media in the world, and you have to kind of take classes from each of these tracks, even if you're focusing on one or the other. But when it came to the media classes, we would talk about TV shows, you know, the fact that American television was watched all over the world, or even blue jeans or something like this, and the effects that fashion had on the world, or something like the microwave, the kind of effects that had on the world. And this was in kind of like a Cold War context. And movies and so on. And all I could think to myself was like, why are we not talking about video games? These are huge. This is a huge industry, products that have a influence across the world, and they're being absolutely left out of this conversation. And so my research focused on trying to basically prove to international relations professors that there was a blind spot in their curriculum. And so, yeah,
that's really cool.
So that's kind of what got me started. And it was during my research for that paper that for the first time I was introduced to authors in academia that were talking about video games. And so they would talk about video games from a variety of perspectives, but I would say it was more of my eyes being open to the fact that research was being done in this field. And so by the time that I had graduated, I was introduced to these authors and to these perspectives. And in that first summer that I was searching for a job, I basically just continued my research. And what was driving my research was the question of, are video games art? And the reason I chose this subject was because, I've been let's say like inside of video game commentary since I was in 8th grade, when it comes to like podcasts and reviews and all these things. And right around this time in 2015, I would constantly see people basically legitimize video games through the title of art consistently. And it is in my nature to always ask the question of, well, why do you think that? Like, why do you think they are art? Do you know what that word means? And I didn't necessarily have the answers to that question. So then it became my goal not only to find those answers, but then relate video games back to the answers that I was finding. So yeah, that's like a really long-winded answer to your question, but that's sort of how I got started with researching.
Right on, man. And I think and I'm going to come back to talking about video games as art here in a second,
Sure.
But I think you and I have similar backgrounds in certain ways. So in my undergrad, I went to school for communication technology. That was my major. And luckily at Ohio State, where I graduated from, they were very progressive with their ways of teaching, and video games were a huge part of the curriculum, which was great. Some of the leading researchers, in fact, when it came to like video games and violence, video games and psychology, were at Ohio State. So I was very fortunate to learn from a lot of those people. One of those professors is the reason why I'm actually here in Seattle, surrounded by the games industry today, which is super great. So in that curriculum, there is a class called Video Games and the Individual, which is taught by a professor by the name of Dr. Richard Husky, who is basically he studies, what would you call him? He's a neurologist, I guess you could call him. He's a licensed fMRI technician, but he also has a fascination with video games and their effect on the brain. So what he does is part of his research is putting people in an fMRI machine and watching their brain activity as they play a game, which was absolutely fascinating to me. But then that extended to the class, Video Games and the Individual, where we learned about all sorts of like how sociology applies to every part of video games, like how different video games affect us. And we began the class with like a brief history of video games, which I, of course, raised my hand every second because I was like, did you know this? Actually, Final Fantasy VII started on the Super Nintendo. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And they called it Mode 7 because...
yeah, pretty much, because I was a fucking nerd, and my teacher's just like, sit down.
Yeah, we got it. Thank you for the footnote there.
Yeah, thank you. Moving on. And so it was because of that class that I made a friend in the professor, and I also met my current roommate, and we ended up podcasting together, which is how I ended up in the world of podcasting, which is how you got me on the mic as it is today. So yeah, that was a super important class, and I took a really huge interest in academia. So I ended up writing basically an undergrad thesis for my research class that was all about the effects of long form game playing and those players' ability to get into a state of flow So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's like theory of flow. And also John Cherry's what the hell was it? Uses and gratifications theory. So it was a paper that I wrote based around that stuff. So long story short, I know what you're getting at, and I love stuff like that, man. And
it was really eye-opening because I had been surrounded by video game discussion that centered around just basic opinion formation, right? Like in a podcast, you would hear a particular person who was somewhat legitimized by the fact that their podcast reached so many people. And because of that legitimization, it gave their opinion a certain amount of weight. Sure. But I would actually kind of argue backwards now from where I stand that those opinions really had no extra weight in the context of being more correct or more well thought out than others. It was really just a consequence of the infrastructure through which their media was distributed that gave them so much authority.
Interesting.
But to see professors publishing work about video games and doing and being exposed to ideas I had never seen before was really sort of the driving force in me wanting to continue to read, because I basically got to see video games spoken about in such a way that I had never seen before. I was used to a specific type of conversation that, as far as I was concerned, was the conversation about video games. And then to finally have someone, yes, like you're saying, even apply different theories from different disciplines across different modes of study in so many different ways it was like waking up from the Matrix, right? It was like this entirely new ball game that you didn't even know existed.
Exactly. It was almost like rediscovering my love for video games in a lot of ways for me personally. You know what I mean? It was just a whole nother way to look at them, like you were saying. And the great thing about video games as a medium is there is no other medium like it where it is completely interactive. And I think that's why video games are so important, because I think, we start with books, then we move into music, radio, then we move into film, movies, and then the next logical step after that is video games, where you interact with the piece of media. And that's just insane that we're like at the level that we are in such a short span of time with the medium of video games. But the argument that yourself and myself like to talk about a lot is the idea of video games being art. And I believe personally that, like I've always, ever since I've heard the argument of like, of course video games are art, right? Because there's, exactly. Even part of it is like, part of a development team is concept artists, right? I mean, they themselves are making the art that, is applied to the assets that go in the game. But it sounds like there's even more nuance to the argument from your perspective. So why don't you expand on that?
Yeah. I basically started to reason from the same place, where I more so posed the question of, oh, you think video games are art? Prove it. Prove it, from a stance of almost like combativeness, where I wanted people who said that to actually think about what they were saying. And it wasn't that I disagreed with them, that I didn't think video games were artworks, but it was more of just me saying, you need to know what you're talking about. And that came from a place of kind of recognizing that video game fans were super passionate about video games, and with that passion came a desire to be legitimized, and that legitimacy for most people stemmed from the title of artworks. Like, if video games are art, then they should be taken seriously. And since we all take video games seriously, they should be art, is kind of how I would summarize the general attitude. And the thing is I basically agree. I read an author very early on that said the experience of playing a game and being in such a state similar to flow, where you lose hours of time without even recognizing it is very, like, when you describe that experience, the description almost matches completely with what is called aesthetic experience. And you hear this phrase when you talk about artworks. And this author basically said, I'm trying to connect aesthetic experience to video games, not because I want to argue whether or not they are or are not art, but simply because aesthetic experience is such a useful tool for understanding what it is like to experience video games.
Sure.
And so when I saw that, I thought to myself, okay, one, I can understand why this author uses this framework of aesthetic experience to explain the experience of video games, but he is taking himself out of the conversation of whether it is or is not art, almost because that's almost like a separate subject. And so for me, I kind of thought to myself, I will take up the mantle. Like, I'm going to operate from the stance that they are artworks, that video games are works of art, just as basic, like, as my assumption to get started, because I am a passionate game player and I do seek that legitimacy. And in that way, I try to reiterate that, like, even though I may sometimes try to highlight the deficiencies of standard video game conversation, I started with, and I still kind of exist in that realm where I want the same legitimacies that everybody else wants, but I want to be the voice who is helping articulate that discussion. Like, if there came a time where we had to have some sort of dramatic tribunal in academia where we needed a representative to stand in front of a board and explain why video games should be taken seriously as an artistic medium, I basically, it was my goal to be that person who could do that. And that is what sort of just has driven me for a couple of years now to just study and study and study because that's the thing, is like, the conversation about what is and is not art has been going around since before the Renaissance. And in that way, video games are just like a data point in that conversation. They're just a new chapter in the book. Whereas as a video game fan, they are the entire book. And to explain or to want to call them artworks is just like a harnessing of a particular discipline. And that to me was also where, like, this entire effort was forged. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so I want to stop and kind of explain a little bit and expand a little bit on flow theory and aesthetic experience. For those of you that don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chase, because I'm a little rusty on this. So flow theory is basically the idea of when there is a balance struck between basically difficulty and experience or ability of a person, flow theory is basically found. So a person hits a state where all realization of passing time is basically they're unaware of it. They become unaware of time passing by, and the task just becomes they're simply just focusing on the task at hand when these conditions are met. But aesthetic experience, I'm actually not familiar with. So if you could detail that, Chase, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I would love to, because it's basically what the entire, aesthetic experience is the lens with which I use to explain video games as artworks. And so flow theory is, I would say, a helpful tool in explaining aesthetic experience, but there are some distinctions to be made. So what you said is true. Like, you enter a state of flow when the challenges that are presented to you perfectly match your ability to overcome them. And in a sort of rising in like a rising trend of the challenge, like the difficulty of the challenge and your ability is where flow is found, where like the challenges are getting harder, but so is it, but also you're able to conquer them in like a steady state.
Right.
Now, that doesn't exactly describe the experience of play, because you can play a game that you have totally mastered, right? Like you can be the best in the world at the first level of Mario, and so the challenge is infinitesimal, like it doesn't even exist, but you're still playing the game. Just as when I'm trying to beat a boss in Dark Souls for the first time, the challenge is so great that I'm actually not in a state of flow and I'm just smashing my head against a wall, but I'm still playing the game. But so that is just to say that flow is not the same as aesthetic experience, even though it is quite similar. And so with aesthetic experience, you're basically, how I understand it is the experience of making meaning out of the world, which is a lot to chew on, but the idea
that's
is
a ton to unpack. Yeah.
Yeah. But the general idea is that like when you're watching a movie and there is nothing between you and the screen, you have totally forgotten what time it is, who you are with, the day-to-day troubles of your life, and the only thing that you're focusing on right now is the actions of the characters on the screen, because you're so interested in what will happen. Yeah, like what will happen next, because there has been so much tension created between the setting up of a certain story and now you want to know the resolution. And with video games, the kind of parallel would be, you know, the rules of the game, and now the game is throwing at you different situations that you need to overcome and make sense of. And it is the sense making capacity of the brain which is creating an aesthetic experience. It's when a game is basically allowing your brain to learn in real time. It is like it's like the mechanics of learning itself that constitute an aesthetic experience, and it's the experience of learning in real time and reacting in such a way that you even know what to do with your hands, with the controller and things like that. That kind of make it's the rules of the game as like a, you know, like as printed on the disc, like the code itself, and then the possibility that those rules allow for, and then the choices that your brain makes, what moves what moves your brain chooses to make, and for what reasons are sort of the aesthetic machinery. How does that all hit you? And to be completely honest, like, I'm still in the middle of researching all this. So a lot of the times when people ask me these questions, it is a little bit of me thinking out loud, which is why sometimes it may not sound too sharp, you know?
No. I think what I gather from what you just explained is that aesthetic experience covers a pretty wide array of what it's like to experience media in some way. Yes. I guess in this case anyway. So, excuse me. So when you were talking about like learning a game, right? So I think, so when you are, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So we'll come back to the Dark Souls example. So when you play something like Dark Souls, especially when it's maybe your first time playing and you're not really that familiar with the quote unquote rules of the game, right? So you come up to, you make it all the way to the Taurus demon, for example. And like, I know for the first time my first time playing that game, that's where I hit my head against the wall, was like, okay, I'm like fucking up. I'm getting destroyed by this boss. And I wasn't hitting float theory, but it hit a point where I kept throwing myself at this boss so many times that I eventually learned the rules of the game. I understood the ins and outs and what the boss was doing and what I should do at certain points in the fight, to the point where I pretty much did hit flow theory, right?
Yeah.
Or a state of flow rather. And my actions were very much measured. I knew exactly what to do when, and I overcame the boss. So in that way, I guess it's like that maybe that as a whole, that whole bit of action there and what you're doing and how you're interacting with the game, would that be fair? Would it be fair to call that the aesthetic experience?
Yeah, because you were learning what actions were correct and incorrect in that time. You know, like every time that you died to that boss, it was a shaving off of the possible actions that you would try the next time. And slowly the game whittled down in your mind the knowledge that you had of what was the correct action, until it got to the point that you had to essentially throw away everything that you knew about playing games previously, because that is what you were acting on at that time, is basically what were successful strategies in the past, and this game was telling you every time that you died that these are not successful strategies. And so then it took legitimate learning in your brain, and this learning is reflected in the real world by the motions of your hands. And I think that's also what's really important about this conversation is talking about how your hands are a part of the meaning making apparatus here, where after you got to a certain point, you then started performing actions that were getting you closer and closer to success. And the drive to want to continue, and every time you were watching the loading screen after a death, you were thinking to yourself, okay, next time I will try this instead of that. And you were thinking in your mind about the moves that you would make, and the mental energy that is required to go through those thought processes is also aesthetic, because it is a testing of strategy. And every time you got to the actual boss, you either got confirmed or denied whether or not your strategy was the correct one. And that entire process of coming up with the correct strategy, which eventually ends in defeating the boss, is the sort of learning the aesthetics of the game, until the point where, you know, let's say you're a speed runner and now you can beat the game without even thinking about it. Well, the aesthetics are kind of dead for you. Like now you're more just executing. Now it's like a test of performance. It's, can you do these things at the specific and correct times, versus can you learn how to do the thing at all? And so the process of not being able to do and not knowing, and then the endpoint of knowing exactly what to do, that gap in between, that is the aesthetics of the game. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So from what I can gather from what you're explaining is that the actual getting into the state of flow is a small part of the aesthetic experience as a whole. So we're throwing around the word aesthetic a ton, but could you give like a rough definition of the word aesthetic in this context?
Yeah, so I'm kind of happy that you even asked that question, because it is a word that I would say defies definition, in the sense that when I read books about art and even about aesthetics in particular, I was surprised to find that very few people define it. And so
weird.
It's almost been a project. It's almost been my own project to even define it at all. And so you will hear in like colloquial conversation the word aesthetic used to describe the visual aspects of any given thing, right? Like the aesthetic of this movie or this video game has to do with like medieval architecture or anime style swords, or you know, a painterly art style.
It's something. It's how something looks. Is exactly how people use it loosely.
It's got a gritty aesthetic or whatever it may be. And I'm not going to be the person who says like, well, actually, you're using it incorrectly. It really means this, that, or the other. I mean, that's the colloquial definition of it, and it makes and it means something to people when they say that.
Yeah, and
But
people know what you're saying too. If like this has a vaporwave aesthetic to it, like people know
Absolutely.
exactly what you're talking about.
yeah, that's a really good example of it, where it conjures up specific meaning in people's minds. But when I think about aesthetics, and where I think that the word has its biggest depth, is basically aesthetics is just a process of meaning making. If you think about artworks in terms of like form, in whether it be a painting as like color, perspective, line, shape, all of the like objective qualities of the work. And with video games, it would be literally the code that is written, the software that was used to create it, the rules of the game itself. Those are sort of the hard constraints. And so then you have the form of the work, and then the form will interact with the person who sees it. And the sort of like the crossing of the two is the aesthetics. And to me, aesthetics just mean meaning making. Like, if I give you a movie to watch, you're going to watch it, and your brain is going to receive all of the information from the screen, and it's going to categorize that information based on prior experiences that you've had, based on what was shown 10 minutes prior to whatever scene you're watching now. Once the credits roll and you've seen the climax is going to structure how you think about the beginning of the movie. All of that experience of categorizing what you've seen in your own mind is the aesthetics of the work. It's what the work means to you as you're experiencing it, and then after you experience it. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's a lot, but I understand what you mean though. Like I think it's one of those weird things where, like, when you explain it, it's a lot, but when it's just in your head or someone brings it up, it just makes sense. You know what I mean? It's just
Yes.
like, it just works. Like, you understand what exactly what you're talking about. So, and so that whole aesthetic experience applied to video game, that's so interesting. So bringing that back to the idea that art, video games are art. So what have you learned about aesthetic experience, and how has that changed the way you look at the video games art argument?
Sure. So basically, like, where my definition of artworks kind of like falls is, artworks are any man-made thing that creates aesthetic experience, right? And so if aesthetic experience is like basically it's the conditions to have an experience with a particular object that creates a ton of meaning, where you can think about it and think about it again. You can interpret it and then reinterpret it. And then somebody says, oh yeah, but did you realize how in the left-hand corner of the screen, there was this blue cup, and the blue cup is supposed to represent this thing? And you're like, holy shit, I didn't realize that. And now I'm rethinking the entire movie about all the times I saw all these other blue cups. And what does that mean? All of the opportunities that you have to like reinterpret things is just the overall capacity of a particular movie's aesthetics, right? And so
Sure.
the more deeply something, like the deeper a particular object's aesthetics are, I would say, like, the more artful it is. And so if we can experience opportunities for meaning in the real world every day. We can look at we can be at the top of a mountain after a long hike and be blown away by a beautiful landscape, and it can cause us to like think about our lives in a particular way and like teach us lessons that we hold with us forever. But almost to just artificially narrow the scope of the discussion, when I talk about artworks, I'm just talking about what people intentionally make. I am talking about media specifically. And that is, like I said, more just for the usefulness of being able to have a discussion, because the bigger we allow the scope to get, it almost becomes impossible to talk about anything, because then there's so many like, but what about, or but in this scenario, like there's so many sort of like buts that you just can never get started.
Right.
So I consider a game, or I consider artworks to just be man-made objects that create aesthetic experience. And the reason why I think video games are artworks is because I think they're kind of, if not the most like aesthetic objects to be created yet. I think that they offer interpretation, and they offer the possibility for playing and replaying them sometimes almost endlessly. Like if you think about a game like Tetris, to me, that is close to one of the most perfect games ever made because of how truly endless it is. And on a moment-to-moment basis, Tetris is like one of the most aesthetic games ever created. So yeah, that's kind of where I throw the weight of my convictions of saying video games are artworks, because they are so fucking aesthetic. They allow meaning making to happen at a massive scale.
Yeah, wow, yeah, that's amazing. I've always like viewed video games as powerful, but in that context, I mean, I think they're especially powerful. And I think what you hit on here with a lot of what you were saying was that, art in and of itself, and a lot of people, and pretty much everyone knows this, is art as an idea is just a giant well of subjectivity.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
So trying to, I guess, argue about art is a fool's errand.
Yeah,
in some ways.
I totally agree.
Because with, every person that agrees with you, there's going to be 100 more that disagree with you.
Right.
Yeah, but I would say, so like getting back to like the idea of making video games. So like I said in the beginning, like part of the video game development process is creating art assets and actually having traditional forms of art as part of making a game. So like in that way, is art really a part of the game when like, so like Tetris is a great example. Like Tetris, the general art style may change, quote unquote, the art style, but the idea of Tetris, if you took all the art away, like the surrounding, like the pretty part or whatever, like then you just have the blocks itself. I mean, would that be considered still art? Would that, I mean, because at that point it is just pure and utter gameplay.
Sure. And there's a almost what is called like a formalist perspective of video games, where in that word formalist, what is the important root is form. And the idea here is that video games, if they are at their truest, quote unquote, truest, most pure form, would just be gray box exercises of prototypes, basically, because gameplay would be at the forefront and it wouldn't matter what the game looked like. And I used to think in that capacity. I used to think that was true. And I don't actually adhere to that notion anymore, because when it comes to interpretation, there are aspects of playing a video game that are visual or auditory that structure the types of interpretations that you make. Like when you play a Gears of War game, for example, the fact that you are playing a specific character who looks a specific way adds to the experience of what you're playing, and even conditions the types of interpretations that your mind has, which has an effect on the aesthetics of the work. But with your specific question about art assets being a part of the video game creation pipeline, then we kind of have to get into like a specific conversation about artworks that I think is important, in the sense that the idea is, in order to have an aesthetic experience, you need to not know what it is you are experiencing. If you have seen the same movie 100 times, and let's say you've read, instead of a movie, let's say you've read a particular book like 15 times. You know what happens at the beginning and the middle of the end, and your brain has basically made every interpretive choice that the book offers. And your mind has settled into one particular interpretation. And so now when you read the book, it's less about trying to experience the story from a new perspective, and it's more about just going through the book almost as like a level of comfort this time. It's like playing a game that you've beaten 100 times just because it feels good to beat it again. And that's not exactly an aesthetic experience. It's more of just a satisfying exercise. And so to kind of like counterbalance that, to have a video game that is aesthetic, it needs to be something new. It needs to be something that you've never experienced before. And this can be on like a large scale of having like your mind totally blown and to experience the creation of like a new genre for the first time in your life, like going from 2D Mario from 3D Mario. Or it can be something a little smaller in scale of a total reinvention of the concept of the action RPG. And that would be like going from Ninja Gaiden to Dark Souls, where it's a smaller field of aesthetics, but those aesthetics exist because you basically had the opportunity to totally learn a new type of iteration of a particular genre. But in each of those examples, what is important is the idea of something new. And something new can be, you know that you're experiencing something new when you have no reference to what you're seeing. And because you have no reference to it, you have to interpret it for the first time. And as we've been talking about, that act of interpretation is the aesthetics of making meaning out of something. And so that is all to get back to your original question around creating like art assets for a game. There is this notion, there's a saying where like this particular art is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think a lot of people have heard this. And it's actually a misquote of a particular line that is that a work is something other than the sum of its parts. And that othering is what is important here. The idea that we put into a game art assets, these are, like let's put buildings here and particular characters with a sword. These are maybe things that we've all known before, but the combination of all of those assets in tandem with the rules of the game may create something other than the sum of all the parts, and that other may be a game we've never experienced before, and therefore creates an opportunity to interpret and to learn, and therefore creates the conditions to have an aesthetic experience. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, actually that makes a lot of sense. I've never really thought of it that way, but yeah, like creating something other than the sum of its parts. That's an interesting perspective because, what a game is during development, and while all the different parts of a development team are doing what it is they do, right? None of those parts look like what you're getting in the box when the game finally, arrives on your PlayStation or on your computer, what have you. You know what I'm saying? So like, in that way, it's not until those parts finally come together that you get the game as we know it on release. So that's super interesting. The thing that I wanted to kind of bring up, so like, I think it's an interesting thought to think about at what point the conversation around video games being art really started. Because if you think back to early parts of video game history, when we were relegated to mainly arcade games and stuff like Atari 2600 and things like that. So you started out with games like Pong, and then into like Pac-Man and Space Invaders and Galaga and games like that. So at that point, would it be fair to say that those games are or are not art? is there a turning point when games like got to a point where, okay, now these are art because there was enough, visual representation, there was enough aesthetically there to tell a story, something to get you into that sort of aesthetic experience. Is that a fair thing to say? Is there a point in which that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're kind of tapping into is a conversation about the progress of artworks and whether or not progress is something that even exists in the conversation about artworks. And so, I used to hear conversations of I went back and played the original Zelda and I don't think it holds up. And that phrase right there, it doesn't hold up, is kind of betrays an assumption. And the assumption is that work from the 80s is no longer aesthetic. It's boring. It's played out. There's nothing there that's interesting to my mind when I interact with it. And so then the question becomes why? Why is that not interesting? Well, it's not interesting because I'm a gamer in the 21st century, and I've played games far more complex, far more visually engrossing. I've played games that offer so many more possibilities in their play space that when I play this one, it's almost like a crude expression of what was possible at the time. And that's basically true. There is the aspect that as we are given new works, like once I've played Dark Souls or once I've played Breath of the Wild, to go back and play games that sort of came before it is to basically see all of the ways that they are not like the games that I have now. And in that capacity, we see how video games progress. But what you have to ask yourself is, if I have not played these other games, would this older game strike me as incredible as it struck the people who played it, right? And when you think about the people who played Pong not knowing about where video games were headed, for them, Pong was probably fucking incredible. The fact that they could interact with paddles and the paddles, the way that they hit this ball, changed the trajectory of how it would bounce. And they thought to themselves, I can't wait to go home and play again because I want to try this strategy or that strategy, or I just want to keep playing it because it's fun to do so. I would say that for them in that moment, the game, yes, it was aesthetic. It was something that they had never seen before. They had never had the opportunity to make sense of. And when they played, whether it was Pong or Galaga or Centipede or Tempest or whatever game it was, these were new expressions of video games that had never come before. Now, for them, it might have been aesthetic, and for us, it may not be. And that's kind of gets to the conversation of, yes, I do think artworks eventually become played out, and what satisfies the game player in the 80s does not satisfy the game player of the 2010s. And the specific moment in history has something to do with how aesthetic these works are. And you can only discover something once. And once it has been discovered, or once you've discovered something that sort of invalidates what came before, as in now that we've played Resident Evil 4, for example, we can never unplay it. And right. Once we've seen it, we are going to compare similar experiences to it. And that's just a fact of existing. So in that way, games can die. And I've written in the past that Dark Souls, for example, is in the process of dying. When that game first came out, it was this amazing experience that showed people something they had never seen before. But now you have speedrunners who can beat the entire game with no armor at level 1 without even being touched. And that is the process of destroying the game. It's that is the process of totally colonizing or like mining out the meaning that it has inside of it, you know?
Yeah. I totally get that. I guess the part of it is that that gets me though is like, when did the conversation around the idea of video games being art begin? Because if I'm someone who grew up in the 70s and into the 80s, you know, saw the transition between arcade to Atari to Nintendo, I mean, if you asked me back then, like, hey, would you consider this art? You know, I feel like they would have a very different answer than what we give today. I'm not saying, I mean, some of them might say yes, but I feel like resoundingly you'd get more no's than yeses because there's just not as much going into it. You know, it's like, I mean, two blocks on a screen hitting a little blip back and forth. I mean, I feel like people would be hard pressed to call that art back then. Sure.
Yeah. And I honestly think it's a really good question, and it's an important question in the sense that I almost agree with you that at the time of Pong happening, they almost weren't concerned with whether or not this was art because they were they were just so enveloped in the technology that they were creating and in the fun that they were having.
Sure.
And so what you're basically talking about, like to actually, if you wanted to answer the question, I think from an academic standpoint of when did the conversation start, you would almost need to go back through the catalog of commentary and media that attached itself to video games, like EGM and different magazines from the 80s through the 90s through the 2000s. And you have to begin tracking how people actually spoke about these things. And the truth is video games they exist in a lineage that started in like the 1910s and 20s of analog table machines based around like baseball or horse racing that were placed in bars that were meant for people to spend money, and they were basically like gambling machines. Like you have a chance to win, and if you win, you get your money back and then some. And for that reason, the very genesis of video game of the conception of games and arcade games, because arcade games were placed in bars because they were in that family of bar games, there was like a sort of derogatory air to them where, of course, they weren't art. They weren't this high-minded piece of media that belonged in a museum. And then you have to begin interrogating what art means to people in different decades. And I don't know the answer to your question. And I think it's honestly a part of where I think my studies need to account for of when did people really start saying video games need to be taken seriously in the conversation of art. And it is my sort of guess that once video games were able to, so we've talked a whole lot about meaning, right? And there's one thing that we can be certain. Every video game will teach the player one thing, and that is how to play it.
Right.
You will always learn how to play the game by playing it. Whether or not you want to continue playing it or you think it's worth playing it, that's a different conversation. But the moment that a video game starts to teach you things that you can then extract out of the game itself and begin to apply to life in general, then that meaning becomes portable. And portable meaning, I think, is where the artistic side of games really starts to crop up. Like, once people begin to play a game like Journey and think to themselves like, wow, what did this teach me about life and death? And is that lesson valid throughout all of my experience? Is it something I can keep with me always? Then we start to say like, wow, this taught me something profound. And that profundity, we want to attach a word to it that sort of equals that profound nature. And a lot of the times we choose that word art in artworks, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and it's not to say that video games even back then didn't have a profound effect on people. I think part of, if, and this is just speculation at this point, but if I had to guess, I think the question of video games being art began around the time when we hit a point where video games could be a little bit more visual, right? Like once we got past the Atari age, right, and we got past the video game crash of 82/83, and then into Nintendo games like the 8-bit era, game makers could start making games that were much more nuanced visually. They could do a lot more. They could show the player a lot more. They could teach the player through the medium a lot easier because they weren't held back as much by technology. They could do a lot more. So I think it hits a point where like art styles become part of the conversation, be part of the development process, especially by the time you hit the 16-bit era. Because I mean, every game by the time you hit the 16-bit era has its own look and its own aesthetic, if you will, its own art. So I if I had to guess, somewhere around the time that we hit the 8 into 16-bit era, like I think that conversation, at least rumblings of that conversation, had to have been started. And then of course, especially once we started to get into 3D, and like, I mean, now it's to the point where it's just kind of, by a lot of people, just assumed that it's art.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I think about what you're saying there, is just, once the technology enabled game makers to basically stimulate the imagination of their players past very basic limits of, like I would consider Pac-Man aesthetic, I would consider Galaga aesthetic, I consider Tetris aesthetic, and even though those they don't really have much like art content, if you will, for lack of a better word, they still provide a vast landscape of decisions to be made. And in that way, on a moment-to-moment basis, they allow for a lot of thought, right? But when you then get to introduce visual elements, which, we talked about how the code itself is the form of the game. Whereas like if a sculpture, the form is the stone, and the paint in a painting, the form is the oils and the pigment, right? It's the thing that exists in reality that structures the entire experience that you have with it. And so, once video game making technology was able to expand even just a little bit, right? Like 8-bit and 16-bit technology is nothing compared to today, but even that was enough to then open up the possibility that game makers were able to tap into, open up the imagination of their players that they could then cultivate. And once that really happened, I think that's when we started to unlock the fantasy and the ability for a player who was experiencing a particular game to remain in a world for longer, where they thought about it when they weren't playing it, or they were thinking about a fantastical storyline now in combination with the actions that their hands were making. So yeah, I mean,
yeah, I'm glad you said that, because thinking about it now, right? So like when we hit the 8-bit era with like the NES in particular, right? Now we start seeing and PC games as well. PC games were doing this before Nintendo got around to it, but then we start seeing games that, even though by today's standards the graphics may be rudimentary, we do start to see a pickup in storytelling, right? Yeah. Think about games like the original Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy 1. You have stories being told about the fight between good and evil. You have interactions between characters. You have writing going into these games. Even before that, you had things in like the 70s and early 80s with computers. You had like text-based RPGs. You had like MUDs and things like that, multi-user dungeons. even before that, I mean, if you want to go tabletop with it, of course, Dungeons and Dragons and so on and so forth. But when we get into a more literal, more visual style known as the video games as we know them today, I think getting like the first of the beginning of the RPG genre, or like The Legend of Zelda, stuff like that, when we have characters that are on screen that are interacting with each other and exchanging dialogue, and games that actually have full-blown writing behind them, and by extension, a lot of these NES games came with manuals that were explaining like world building and lore behind what was going on to help you out, you know, with imagining what was happening in this world. At that point, I think I mean, that would be the turning point, right? That's the turning point when games become more than just two blocks hitting a blip back and forth in Pong. You know, they become so much more just by adding that aspect in of writing, of dialogue.
There's a part of me that says yes, because I have to recognize that the concept of narrative is so deeply rooted in our psyche that you have philosophers like Carl Jung who, extrapolates, like 12 primary archetypes, and all of experience can be explained by these archetypes. And we see these stories being retold over and over again from before the Bible through Shakespeare till now. And in that way, the moment that video games were able to sort of tap into that lineage, it certainly opened up the capacity for their ability to explore new narratives and new stories and make meaning in that way. And I don't want to discount that. And I used to be the person that got fairly annoyed that narrative seemed to be the only legitimizing factor in video games. And I would say now, I would say nowadays that like it's perfectly acceptable to talk about narrative from the perspective of narrative actually being a playful, aesthetic type of structure that allows for interpretation of the brain. And even if you read a book, it's not as linear as it may seem. Yes, you have to read the words in a specific order, but really the reader gets to choose what the words mean. And when you and I read the same book, we may have different interpretations of it, and that's where the aesthetics come into play for narrative. But when it comes to games, like, yes, I do think that there's something to be said about once the technology enabled creators to begin interacting with this narrative legacy, that we were then exposed to new possibilities of meaning making. But at the same time, I do want to bring up games like The Witness, or games like Fez or Hohokam, or those are the ones that come to mind immediately for me now. But abstract titles that don't rely on story per se, in terms of like a specific story, with like a beginning, middle, and end, but I would say still utilize video games' core defining trait as a medium, which is like a procedural experience. And in that way, there's still things to be there's still like studying to be done in terms of how do we, like, what does it mean that games are so open-ended and so engaging even when they don't have narrative context? And what does that say about the human mind? And what does it say about the human being that we can play rounds of Fortnite over and over and over again for the rest of our lives? Like, there's almost something revealing about us that games like Overwatch or StarCraft sort of illuminate by the very nature of the fact that we play them over and over again. And there's no specific story in a game of StarCraft, but there's something else happening. And I think that something else is, it's artistic and it's important. So yeah, for me, there's an agreement with what you said, but I think there actually is even still something more past that,
Yeah, I mean, and that's crazy to think about, but part of me also wonders too, like making games like that where there's, I mean, a lot of it is environmental storytelling. I think part of that too comes with the ability to, like, I mean, the fact that they had the technology to do all that, because I mean, I don't think there's a way that you could do a crazy amount of environmental storytelling on an Atari 2600. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, you're just limited at that point with expression. You might be able to pull it off on, you know, say a Nintendo or stuff like that if you don't have a game with a hard and fast narrative, but you're trying to tell use environmental storytelling. It may be possible. So I'm definitely not ruling that out, and I think that's definitely all part of the experience. In fact, I wouldn't put it past like indie developers. Like there might be an environmental storytelling 8-bit game out there somewhere. I'm almost positive that's a thing. So I guess what it comes down to is like back to the well of subjectivity, right? Like it's all how you perceive it. And as long as you're having, I guess, that aesthetic experience, that's really what it comes down to, you know?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, like the conversation of art to me is one of the most subjective conversation. In fact, it is like the definition of subjective conversation, where there can be a specific set of circumstances based on who you are, where you're from, how you were brought up, and in what time period you live in, that make a particular game or movie incredibly aesthetic to you. And there's nothing I can say about that, and it would still be aesthetic, and that thing would still be a work of art to you. And but at the same time, I think where a lot of people like to go is like, can we point to specific works that are just aesthetic for a lot of people, you know? Or can we say that the fact that video games are as popular as they are and are as played by as many people as they are, does that actually have an effect on human civilization? And if yes, then that is kind of the profound nature of the aesthetics of games. And in that way, the result, like the result of the fact that video games exist, that is like an objective fact of reality. It's an objective fact of history. And I am someone who believes that like reality exists, right? That like, even though my sensory organs of my body filter reality, I believe that I'm experiencing something outside of myself. And art is a perfect way to kind of revel in the subjectivity of experience, where like the kinds of situations that are not a good place to revel in subjectivity are questions of like right and wrong, good and evil. And I do believe that those things exist, and I believe that there actually are right interpretations of those questions. And that's not a place where you want to introduce total subjectivity. But I try to often tell people that, like, if you are a massive collector and enjoyer of video games, like, you're probably very wealthy in the grand scheme of the world. You know, when you compare yourself to the total experience of the billions of people that live here, if you are able to devote yourself to arguing about whether or not video games are art or not, well, then you're pretty fucking lucky that you don't have other things to worry about, because largely this conversation doesn't really fucking matter for a lot of people. And I do think it's worthwhile to explore the creative possibilities of the human mind. I have to also recognize that because of who I am and where I live, those grant me the ability to even think about these things. And there's almost a part of me that, you know, like, once I'm done with this project of writing a book on video games and aesthetics, it's like, okay, I've had my fun. Now it's time to go make a real difference in the world and actually work for a particular organization that helps actual people, because video games are a luxury item, and even making them is a luxury. Like, the amount of electricity and time and technology it takes to make a video game is pretty substantial, and all of that effort could be being devoted to helping people in the most abject poverty in the world. And it's something that I'm not doing, and I think about that too often, and I think it's something that we shouldn't lose sight of. So yeah, I mean, I don't really know how I got here, but that's also a part of this entire conversation that maybe it doesn't come up very often.
Yeah, I mean, and what you say is true. It's certainly that the fact that we even get to have this conversation is a bit of a luxury too. And so I think that's the great thing about art, and then by extension video games, though, is that people are so passionate about this medium because there's so much to unpack about this medium, and so many different aspects of it, and there's this huge culture, there's this huge industry, there's this, I mean, millions upon, if not billions of fans, this is something that is beloved, and I think it's here to stay. And I think that I would go as far as to say is video games are a big part of what's going to push technology forward, because the use cases for video games aren't simply just for pleasure and pastime. I think it's going to turn into, I mean, it could go as far as, I mean, they're video games are already being used to help people that have certain, physical ailments, or people that, have PTSD from fighting in a war or stuff like that. They're already helping people. And so I think it's going to turn into that thing that, video games are going to turn into something that is bigger than Nolan Bushnell ever intended it to be. I think video games turn into this huge worldly force that is the reason why we have certain technology, and the reason why we can live a certain way that we do. And even in some aspects, I would go as far as to say that we're going to hit a point, with VR and virtual reality becoming the way it is, that it might even blur with our own reality. It's a very real possibility, I think. Maybe even with the way we're going with technology, it might happen within the next 50 years. So I think that ultimately video games and the reason why they're so talked about, there's just so much to everything surrounding video games as an idea. And so I guess as we're kind of winding down here, I guess one final question I have to ask you is so we've been doing a lot of looking back to the past when it comes to video games and art, but kind of hitting on the idea of so when we move forward, right? And so say we live in a future where video games hit a point where we're blurring video games with reality because virtual reality technology just gets that good. So how do you imagine that changes the aesthetic experience?
I mean, I don't know. It's hard to be predictive in that way, but
no, if you interpret it in your own head, how do you see it?
I will constantly come back to the idea of aesthetics relying on the newness and the novelty of experience. And the moment that technology, what I don't believe is that enhancement in technology necessarily moves art forward every time. Just because we can, I think God of War is a really great example where we kind of have this new achievement of melding gameplay with script writing and video and cinematography, right? Where when you take, I think, each of those disciplines on their own separately, there's nothing new about any of it. But it was just the fact that it was all put together that kind of creates something new. I didn't find the latest God of War game to be the best video game I'd ever played, or to be really like very aesthetic in terms of like being some sort of medium defining moment. It was more to me just an achievement of production. It was like, wow, a production team was able to kind of rest all of these things under one umbrella. And that in itself is kind of aesthetic, to think about, but not that deeply rich. And so if technology basically creates the conditions for us to experience something that we've never seen before, but two, totally changes the way that maybe we view ourselves or the world around us, then I think it becomes like a prolific achievement in artwork and meaning making, right? Like if something about integrating virtual reality or augmented reality into the real world, creating new conditions for play that have never been seen before, but also create meaning that is portable into everyday life in such a way that like changes the way that we think about ourselves or each other or society, then it would be artistic, and truly impactful. And if it can't, then I don't think it would be.
And on that note, we'll close her up, Chase.
All right,
Thank you so
man.
much for being on, Chase, man. I appreciate you. It was great to finally podcast with you. Do you want people to be able to find you on social media?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really. I'd say like this last month, I've not tweeted a single thing, but you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Bodacious Chase. As of this point, I log in just to check to see if anyone's reached out to me, and if you reach out to me, I will try always to message you back. So yeah, you can find me there. And that's really it. I also want to thank you, Collin, for the opportunity to podcast with you.
My pleasure, man.
I'll be honest, like it's not every day that I get to talk about these subjects in depth, because even though I was motivated to talk about these things because of the video game landscape around me, I would actually say I've been surprised in recent years to find how little traction these ideas get. And it is truly joyful for me to be able to have conversations like this. And so I thank you for being interested in it and talking with me about these subjects, dude. So thank you.
Absolutely. And you're welcome on anytime, Chase. Just reach out. You know the deal.
For sure.
All right, everybody. This has been Collin and Mano. You have been great. And we will see you next time.
Later.
And there you have it. My conversation with Chase Williams. What'd you think? Would love to know on the social medias. You know the deal. You can reach out to me with any questions, thoughts, ideas, concerns that you have. collinandmano@gmail.com. Again, Collin and Mano on both Twitter and Instagram if you want to hit me up there. Once again, intro song by Light Before Us, written and produced by Christian Crump. And that'll do it for today's episode. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week. See you Wednesday.